Hi ladies and gents. Tonight we wander somewhere older than time and softer than dreams, to a place where sandals slap stone floors, candles flicker low, and the only real drama is whether Brother Oswin remembered to feed the scriptorium cat. Now close your eyes, or keep them slightly open if you're still holding your tea. Let the day drift off like a Viking ship on a slow current, in no particular rush to arrive. Tonight, we're stepping gently back into long-ago Scandinavia, with its crispy fjord breezes, echoing horn calls, and yes, Vikings. But before you brace for battle cries and axe-swinging mayhem, don't worry. This isn't the part of history with raids and roaring sagas. Know this. This is about sleep. Because if there's one thing Viking Age people did extraordinarily well, besides fermenting things and looking dramatic in wool capes, it was sleeping. Deeply, dreamily, defiantly. The kind of sleep even a goat bell couldn't interrupt. It all starts, not in a longship, but in a longhouse. Picture a Viking longhouse. It's warm. Not just candle warm, hearth warm. Center of the room, low smouldering fire warm. The walls are timber and turf, and if you're lucky, a family of chickens has found their corner, having philosophical clucks about worms. The roof is thatched tightly enough to block out the northern wind, but loosely enough to let the smoke rise lazily into the rafters, finding its way out through the smoke hole, which does its job most of the time. Inside, everyone, parents, kids, grandma, that one guy who's just always there. They all sleep in the same space. Now this might sound chaotic to our modern sensibilities, but consider it from the perspective of the medieval Scandinavian climate. It was cold, and not decorative scarf cold, just proper ancestral winter. A group snuggle wasn't just cozy, it was good survival policy. Like communal taxes, but with more blankets made of sheepskin. By the way, yes, they had sheepskin blankets, sometimes fur, and layers of thick wool. The kind of scratchy wool that would probably file away your worries as you fell asleep just from texture alone. There wasn't a lot of nighttime anxiety back then. When the sun dipped behind the mountains, there were no Instagram reels about someone else's sourdough to compare yourself to. No inbox-induced dread lurking behind your eyelids. No 3 a.m. text from your cousin Sven asking if you want to invest in his new runestone crypto startup. Nope. The only thing the Vikings needed to check before bed was whether the livestock had wandered dramatically into the family pantry again. Now, let's talk beds. Or not quite beds. Most Viking families didn't have beds as we know them, those soft clouds on sprung frames. Instead, they had raised wooden platforms, or sometimes just cozy straw patted down into a sleepable depression, a sort of cuddle trench shared with people you trusted, and, occasionally, a piglet named Freuer who didn't believe in personal space. But don't be fooled. These weren't sad piles of straw. They often layered things: woolen blankets, stitched linens, animal skins. They did the best they could with what they had. And thanks to the natural fibers, the bed smelled more like earthy sheep poetry than anything offensive. Nighttime itself was different too. The Viking world was drenched in quiet. Not just the physical quiet of unpaved villages and candlelight, but the mental quiet of pre-electric life. There was something about sleeping under the stars, knowing your biggest stressors were whether your thatch was leaking or if the pickled herring had frothed too aggressively. And here's the kicker. Vikings may have practiced segmented sleep, that is, 2 sleeps per night. One that started just after dark and ran until a couple of hours past midnight, and then a second one following a gentle, meditative, middle-of-the-night wakefulness. People in the Dark Ages weren't just sleeping, they were luxuriating in rest. That quiet interlude between sleeps was often spent whispering stories, making quiet prayers to the old gods, or simply lying still with open eyes listening to the snow settling on the turf. Imagine that the next time you check your phone at 2:47 a.m. So yes, the people of Viking times might have had rough boats and enthusiastic personal hygiene habits, but boy did they sleep like heroes. Deeply, wrapped in wool and each other, soothed by crackling fires and windless silence. And if you're wondering whether their dreams were filled with vast fjords, iron necklaces, and suspiciously judgmental sheep, all signs point to yes. Now, before your own dreams kick in, why not press that like button before your eyelids press themselves? Who knows? Maybe YouTube's algorithm appreciates sheepskin trivia as much as you do. Sleep well, traveler. As we drift gently into the hush of Viking evenings, picture this: a cold wind curling off the North Sea, brushing the sides of longhouses with whispers shaped like lullabies. Inside those long, turf-roofed halls, half fortress, half family room, the Norse folk were settling in for the night. And unlike most of us, doomed to the discordant lullabies of traffic and phone notifications, the Vikings, they were professionals at snoozing. You might think any people who spent their days swinging axes and bracing against sleet would have sleep patterns resembling startled squirrels. But no, the Vikings understood something we've long forgotten. Comfort can be carved from the landscape, and bedtime is best taken seriously when your mornings might involve angry Saxons or slightly drunk moose. To begin with, the Viking longhouse was a marvel of prehistoric feng shui, with a dash of organized chaos. Built mostly of timber, stone, and turf, it provided insulation that would make any modern minimalist weep with envy. The walls, thick as the legs of a prize ox, kept out the wind and held in the warmth. And in the center, a hearth burned day and night like the sleepy heartbeat of the house. No LED blue light to ruin your melatonin, just good old-fashioned firelight, flickering like a bedtime story whispered by flames. And speaking of bedtime stories, Vikings told plenty. Sagas of gods hurling hammers and dragons that hoarded treasure like your aunt with reusable gift bags. These stories were not just epic, they were effective. Nothing soothes the warrior spirit like hearing about Thor smashing frost giants right before tucking into your straw mattress. Now, let's wander over to that mattress. It's not quite memory foam, unless you mean the memory of every goat, sheep, and occasional squirrel that contributed to its fluff. Viking beds were handmade wooden frames, sometimes ornately carved, with a sleeping mat of straw wrapped in woven wool or animal hair. Yes, the scent may have been rustic, but oh, the warmth. Layers of furs and thick blankets provided insulation that rivaled most modern sleeping bags. And snuggling was not a romantic preference, it was a necessity. In the cold months, whole families, and perhaps the occasional chicken, curled together like spoons in a drawer. But the real secret? The rhythm of their lives. Unlike today's caffeine-soaked chaos, Viking days followed the sun's lead. Up with the dawn, chores by daylight, and when the sky turned its velvet shade of dusk, the longhouse slowly dimmed. No lights to override your natural sleep cycle, and certainly no social media doom scrolling. Just the soft crackle of firewood and the wisdom of quiet. Evening rituals were humble, low-tech, and deeply human. A bowl of stew, some mead, not the fruity kind your cousin brews in his garage, but the real deal, brewed in clay pots with wild honey and just enough magic to smooth the edges of the day. And then, perhaps a riddle contest. Yes, Viking culture loved riddles. You haven't lived until you've heard a bearded man try to poetically describe a turnip without using the word turnip. As sleep inched closer, the longhouse would settle into silence, not oppressive, but gentle. Sounds softened. The creak of the hearth, the breathing of beasts outside, the occasional snore from Uncle Bjorn, who, despite being a fearsome axe-wielder, snored like an affectionate walrus. And the people would drift off, wrapped in wool and legend. Let's not forget their architectural cleverness. Raised sleeping platforms to stay above the cold drafts that slithered along earthen floors. Even the livestock shared in this design logic, penned in stalls along the rear of the house, giving off just enough residual warmth to turn the dwelling into a cozy co-sleeper's paradise. Picture it, the faint smell of cow, a lowing sigh in the dark, and the comforting certainty that nothing was trying to steal your electric toothbrush, because it didn't exist. Bliss. Unlike our modern existence of night shifts and box set binges, the Viking sleep was ritualistic, essential, communal, and oddly luxurious. Not in silk sheets and slippers sort of way, but in that deep, honest kind of rest that only shows up when your body is tired, your belly is full, and your anxiety hasn't been fed for hours. And so, as the north wind turned the world silver with frost and flames danced on carved beams, the Viking household slept, with bellies warm from broth and minds full of thunder gods and midnight riddles. Their slumber was deep, uninterrupted, and, if you ignored the occasional goat bleat, eerily peaceful. Somewhere the coals hissed softly, and sleep drifted through the long hall like a cloak. Everyone tucked in, nothing to fear but the distant grumble of dreams. But you may be wondering, what about when they left their villages, when they set sail into stormy seas with only the stars for pillows? Well, settle back, because that is a tale in itself. By the flickering warmth of a hearth, in a place half carved from wood and half carved from wind, the Viking longhouse stood like a sleeping beast. Long, low, smoky, and snug. This was not a five-star hotel. This was a one-star, one-fire, multi-family slumber situation. And yet, somehow, it was magnificent. Imagine stepping inside one of these ancient Scandinavian chalets. You bend to enter, because the doorframe is claiming sacrifices today. Ducking under the low roof, you are met with the gentle buzz of human existence. Crackling fire in the center, a glint of amber light waltzing through the smoke above, and bodies huddled in peaceful heaps, wrapped in furs so thick they could double as domestic livestock. The longhouse was the Viking version of open-plan living, but instead of overpriced kitchen islands and mood lighting, there was a central fire pit, moodfully smoky. The fire didn't just cook the stew and dry the socks, it warmed the sleep. Heat rose and roof beams gently roasted, filling the room with a kind of cedar-scented calm that soaked into your bones. Smoke threaded its way out through a narrow roof vent that Vikings swore was perfectly adequate, and your lungs eventually adjusted. Now, housing in Viking societies wasn't exactly spacious. Longhouses were, as the name suggests, long, not wide, not high. Basically, they were the architectural equivalent of a loaf of rye bread. You didn't get your own room. You barely got your own blanket. Depending on your social standing, you might sleep on a wooden platform alongside your extended family, your goats, and what we can only call questionable smells. But somehow, all of this contributed to a strangely cozy communality, like one massive sleepover. If the sleepover also involved mending fishing nets and dodging the occasional chicken. Let's take a moment to appreciate just how committed the Vikings were to their bedtime routine. even without knowing what sleep hygiene meant. Their bedding was typically stuffed with straw, feathers, or wool, often layered with animal skins. Better yet, some had mattresses made of down, which in 9th century Scandinavia was essentially mattress nobility. The Norse word dina, which gives us our modern duvet, wasn't invented for nothing. Their furs weren't just coverings, they were privacy dividers, soundproofing, and your only chance at warmth in February. Pile enough reindeer hides on someone, and you'll find they snore like they've never heard of anxiety. But what truly set Viking slumber apart was the strange magic of rhythm. Life followed the cadence of nature. No backlit screens glowing with emails. No 3 a.m. existential scrolling sessions. The sun was their clock, and their circadian rhythms would have made today's sleep scientists weep with envy. When darkness came, it came early and persistently, especially in winter. With so little daylight, nights could last up to 16 hours. That's not bedtime, that's bed epic. Interestingly, the Vikings seem to have practiced what modern researchers now call segmented sleep. They didn't plunge into unconsciousness for one solid 8-hour chunk. Instead, they slept in segments, falling asleep early in the dark, waking up in the middle of the night for a brief stretch of calm wakefulness, then dozing off again until dawn. That midnight wakeful period wasn't insomnia. It was a quieter, more contemplative intermission. People might pray, talk quietly, or even, believe it or not, visit neighbors. Imagine waking up at 2 a.m. just to pop in next door for some existential chat and boiled fish. And while we're on the subject of fish, let's not forget the Viking diet, which helped lull them into nightly food comas worthy of a nap-induced Viking saga. Fatty fish, broth-rich stews, and warm porridge filled their bellies and stabilized their blood sugar, creating a full-body cozy zone fine-tuned for falling into a deep, fleece-lined slumber. Another secret weapon? Mead. That famously honeyed drink was not just for toasting victories and Odin's good moods. It also worked wonders as a pre-bed tipple. Back then, sleep was not a guilty pleasure. It was essential, sacred even. The Norse gods themselves prioritized rest. Odin might have been the All-Father, but even he occasionally sat out a battle or two, presumably for a decent nap. And Thor? Tell me he wasn't the god of naps every time he hurled his hammer and promptly passed out with his boots on. So there you have it. In between conquering continents and inventing the Scandinavian sweater aesthetic, the Vikings made time to honor the nap. Their sleeping quarters were smoky, their mattresses were scratchy, and the company occasionally mooed, but without emails, artificial light, or caffeine-fueled existential dread. Vikings found a way to sleep like legends. Of course, deep beneath the furs and slower heartbeats, a new curiosity was beginning to stir, because while the longhouse offered its own kind of lullaby, it was the whisper of the northern sky that hinted at something else entirely. Fun fact, the Vikings didn't just spend their days pillaging coastal villages and braiding their beards. They also had a rather sophisticated attitude toward getting a good night's sleep. Yes, the same people who could swing a battle axe with the elegance of a figure skater doing the triple salchu were also deeply committed to the art of rest. And in this part of their chilly, wind-tousled world, where the stars blinked like shy companions and the northern lights occasionally danced like tipsy forest spirits, bedtime was practically sacred. First, let's talk location. A Viking longhouse wasn't exactly a 5-star hotel with a mini fridge and complimentary soap, but it did have its charms. These long, timber-framed halls were expertly insulated with turf. Yes, the very grass of the earth, carefully stacked to keep out the sharp Scandinavian chill. Inside, the air was thick with the sweet smell of birchwood smoke, smouldering from a long central hearth. The fire never truly went out. It simply sank into a lazy slumber, glowing like the drowsy eye of some ancient dragon. Now, one doesn't simply flop down on a hay bale after a long day of shipbuilding and sheep wrangling. Beds were serious business. Viking beds were often crafted from oak or other dense wood, and while minimalist in design and likely a touch squeaky, they were usually cozy, alcove-shaped constructions nestled along the walls of the longhouse. Think of them as early prototypes for bunk beds, minus the IKEA hex key. These bed spaces were curtained off with woolen drapes or animal hides, offering both privacy and a bit of insulation. Not bad for people who had a deeply adversarial relationship with both Christianity and central heating. As for bedding, oh, the Vikings embraced fluff. Mattresses were filled with straw or feathers, and over time, sheep's wool became a favorite. These materials were not chosen at random by sleepy warriors stumbling through inventory. Straw was common and practical, but feathers were what dreams were made of, quite literally. If a Viking had a feather mattress, it usually meant they were fairly well off or very persuasive with their pillow supplier. Let us not overlook the sleepwear, or lack thereof. While there's no definitive record of Freydis Eriksdottir slipping into a flannel nightgown, it's believed that most Vikings preferred to sleep in something akin to their undergarments, a linen tunic, or perhaps nothing at all, depending on the season and whether one's longhouse had reliable draft-proofing. It's been said that cuddling wasn't just for comfort, but also part of a well-executed survival strategy. Body heat was the Viking version of central heating, and snuggling wasn't optional, it was vital. Family, friends, and even livestock occasionally shared the same roof, if not the same blankets. This may sound unglamorous, but if you've ever shared a winter with a moody fjord wind, you might see the logic. Speaking of livestock, chickens and goats were known to meander through longhouses like sleepy roommates. Their presence added warmth and, well, mild inconvenience. Imagine trying to drift off while a goat softly chews nearby. But to a Viking, it was just another lullaby from the natural world. Alongside the flicker of the hearth and the occasional gust rattling through the thatch, sleep wasn't rushed. The Viking night was long, especially during the winter months when the sun made only the briefest of cameos. People respected these dark hours as a time for dreaming, not scrolling. Though a skald might entertain with a quiet saga or a whispered myth, occasionally involving frost giants or Thor losing his hammer again. These bedtime stories weren't just filler. They were part of cultural memory, stitched into the gaps between chores and storms. Falling asleep to tales of gods and great-grandparents gave the Viking mind something to chew on with its eyes closed. So, while we might lie awake wondering what tomorrow's inbox holds, the Vikings' pre-sleep routine was far simpler. Tuck in, scoop an armful of warmth from a sheep or a spouse, and drift into sleep under the protective gaze of wooden roof beams lashed and angled like the ribs of a long-forgotten ship. Darkness stretched out like a woolen tapestry, and they let it hold them. And as we settle into that thought, like slipping beneath an elk-hide quilt, we might begin to sense the tug of twilight ourselves, which, oddly enough, flows perfectly into our next dreamy diversion. Let's keep drifting. The Norsemen, rugged and ruddy, might seem like unlikely paragons of slumbering grace, Big beards, bigger axes, boats with dragon heads. Hardly the resume of a people known for bedtime finesse. But therein lies the mistake. The Vikings didn't just conquer coastlines. They quietly mastered the art of restful living between raids. And yes, it all started with how they treated the very idea of nighttime. After a busy day of rowing, raiding, or reciting epic poems in longhouses scented with smoked fish and slightly too many unwashed tunics, the Vikings didn't simply collapse into a heap of pelts like exhausted wolves. No, they had rituals. Evening rituals. The kind you might find in a Gwyneth Paltrow newsletter, but with more mead and fewer jade eggs. Now, let's drift to a quiet fjord settlement in the year 865. The last rays of the midsummer sun paint the eastern sky with iron-wrought oranges. A gentle mist rises from the grass. The sheep are already asleep, and the scent of wood smoke laces the air like some ancient Viking diffuser. Inside the longhouse, which was more long than house, families huddled in clustered beds along the walls. There were no king-sized mattresses or memory foam, but what they had worked just fine. Beds were hand-built from local timber covered in fur, straw, and, quite often, at least one snoring uncle. Sleeping arrangements were cozy, very cozy. Picture a sleepover with every relative you've ever had. Now picture it for your entire life. Privacy wasn't so much a concept as it was a myth. But this closeness fostered warmth, thermal and emotional. Bed sharing was as much a social necessity as it was a survival tool during the harsh Scandinavian winters, when the wind outside sounded like an angry troll who didn't finish his nap. To prepare for bed, many Vikings would wind down with stories. Oral storytelling was the Netflix of the Norse world, and the content was surprisingly binge-worthy. Tales of Thor's misadventures, Loki's regrettable schemes, and surprisingly detailed genealogies passed from mouth to memory like lullabies made of legend. And just as you clutch your favorite blanket, they too had their own nighttime companions. Besides the furs and feather-stuffed pillows, yes, feather pillows, Vikings had those. Some slept with charms or tokens. A small Thor's hammer amulet under the head, for instance, was thought to defend against both insomnia and mischievous spirits. Handy. Then there was the matter of lighting, or rather, the lack of it. Vikings didn't sleep bathed in blue glow from rectangular boxes that showed you things you didn't ask to see. Once the hearth embers dimmed and the last candle sputtered, darkness took the reins. Not a digital darkness with a dimmed phone. Full, vast, immersive midnight. It wrapped around them like a woolen cloak tailor-made for deep rest. Even the Norse calendar encouraged healthy rhythms. With longer nights in winter, people naturally slept more. Modern scientists call it circadian entrainment. Vikings simply called it what you do when it's too dark to do anything else. The average adult Viking may have gotten a blissful 9 or 10 hours of sleep in winter, a number that would make any modern sleep doctor weep into their espresso. And when they dreamed, they likely dreamed in runes and ravens. Norse culture placed deep importance on dreams. Some believed dreams carried messages from the gods or offered glimpses into the future. A good night's sleep wasn't just rest, it was divine correspondence. Falling asleep next to a crackling fire, head cushioned by feathers and myth, who's to say you wouldn't wake up with a new destiny? Now, let's not pretend they had it all figured out. Bedbugs were absolutely not invited, but showed up anyway. If someone on the fur pile decided to snack on pickled herring at midnight, well, good luck to everyone's olfactory nerves. And if a neighbor snored with the force of a collapsing longship, there was no mute button. But even so, there was something deeply restorative about the Viking night, a kind of symphony of rituals, nature, and shared warmth that lulled even the fiercest warriors into gentle slumber. So the next time someone tells, "You Vikings were all blood and thunder, remember?" they also just wanted a good nap after a long day of being intimidating. They pillaged, yes, but they also pillowed. And as the fire dims in our imagined longhouse, and little Bjorn rolls over with his glockenspiel-sized wooden sword tucked under his fur, we float a little farther into the Nordic night, toward the land where sleepers aren't just resting, they're dreaming of sagas to come. Picture, if you will, the interior of a Viking longhouse at the heart of a fjord-draped settlement, sometime in the mid-9th century. Outside, the wind croons its ancient lullaby, dancing through pine trees and whispering over the rooftops like a bearded grandfather telling bedtime stories to the stars. Snowflakes tap lightly on the wooden planks of the roof, the Norse equivalent of a white noise machine. But inside everything hums with warmth. The longhouse is dim, lit by the gentle flicker of whale oil lamps and the deep amber glow of a central hearth, which burns steadily with logs that smell faintly of pine and history. Smoke curls lazily up through a smoke hole in the roof, taking its sweet time, in absolutely no rush to escape. The air carries a mellow, smoky richness, 1 part comfort, 2 parts might need to air this out come spring. And here they are, Viking families, gathered like firewood in cozy arrangement, wrapped in furs, lying side by side like a particularly affectionate pile of laundry. Their beds, if one could call them that, were not solitary affairs as one might imagine today. No fluffed mattresses, no orthopedic pillows, no bedtime podcasts. Just raised wooden platforms packed with straw bedding, moss, animal hides, and a generous helping of family members, pets, and occasionally a goat who refused to sleep anywhere else. Contrary to popular belief, Vikings didn't sleep in horned helmets, if only because helmets make terrible pillows and worse bedfellows. Their nightwear was delightfully practical, usually tunics or woolen underclothes. The Norse were many things, seafarers, raiders, and poets, but they were also champions of sensible bedtime attire. There's only so much pillaging one can do without a good night's sleep and a breathable nightshirt. Interestingly, the warmth of the longhouse was not delivered through splendid insulation or central heating. No, it came from the combined body heat of the household, humans being above all portable radiators. People, dogs, and babies all huddled together in a snug little mass of life and snoring. Viking sleep wasn't solitary. It was a team sport, and lest you think this arrangement chaotic, it was remarkably well organized. In many households, the longhouse was divided into sleeping platforms along the walls, with the wealthier or elder members claiming the corners, prime napping real estate. The central hearth made sure that no one froze their toes off, and above, in the rafters, dried fish and herbs slept their own eternal slumber, perfuming the air with a curious blend of runoff seawater and rosemary. Many Viking nights were framed in 2 distinctive sleep periods, not because of stress or smartphones, but because the rhythm of the night guided them. After the sun surrendered to the horizon, folks would drift into first sleep, a solid span of several hours. Then, to the surprise of modern sleep researchers, they'd often wake for an hour or 2 in the middle of the night, just awake, a period known to early Europeans as the watch or second wake. Vikings might use this time to stoke the fire, whisper with family, or, if the weather allowed, go outside and commune silently with the stars. Imagine this: snow falling delicately on the fjord, stars unfolding across the canvas of the sky like silver runes, and a Viking man stepping out in a fur cloak to inspect the constellations, perhaps trying to remember which one resembles a giant goat. This nighttime intermission wasn't a source of anxiety, but a sacred pause. The Norse believed night itself held power, mystery, and more than a little wisdom. Then came the second sleep, in which everyone returned to their straw-cushioned dens, often more deeply rested than before. This segmented sleep pattern wasn't unique to the Vikings, but they perfected it, turning it into a gentle rhythm of the cold northern night. Some anthropologists today even envy their chromatically undisturbed relationship to circadian rhythms. The Vikings may have swung axes during the day, but at night, their nervous systems swayed in harmony with the firelight, unrushed, unbothered, and unfailingly drowsy. And what did they dream about, these weary Norse folk? Perhaps of green pastures in distant lands, smooth sailing ships under a full moon, or feasts where no one ran out of mead. After all, in the Norse sagas, the gods themselves were no strangers to naps. Odin might have one eye open, but even he had to rest sometime. As the flames of the longhouse fire dim, casting sleepy shadows on timbers older than memory, we tiptoe forward, past the snoring hounds and the bundled families, toward a different kind of nightly shelter, where dreams begin their night shift inside an entirely unexpected place. If you were to slip quietly into a Viking longhouse one chilly evening, you'd find something rather unexpected. Not a room full of sword-clanging berserkers sharpening axes and growling about raids, but rather a scene so peaceful, so bizarrely domestic, that it might just lull you into a nap right then and there. At the heart of the longhouse, the hearth glowed with embers. It was the kind of fire that didn't shout, just whispered warmth into wooden beams and straw-filled eiderdowns. Around it, great bristly warriors, some with names like Eric the Reasonably Calm or Astrid of the Suspiciously Nice Blankets, lounged on fur-topped benches, sipping warm mead and playing a lazy round of Nefertafel, the Viking board game that functioned as both entertainment and subtle training in battle tactics, as if Scrabble and chess had a robust, horned-helmeted baby. But what truly made the Norse evening worth its weight in goose feathers was what happened when the day drew its curtain, and sleep, glorious sleep, descended like a fog over the fjords. You see, Viking society wasn't just about raiding monasteries and growing epic beards that defied reason and wind resistance. They also knew how to sleep with style. The real secret, perhaps, lay in their philosophy. Nighttime wasn't a weakness, it was a sacred pause. Time to rest, yes, but also time to reconnect with dreams, ancestors, and a rather alarming number of snoring livestock. Beds were a family affair, literally. Most people didn't have bedrooms in the modern sense. Instead, a longhouse might have one large shared sleeping room, where families cuddled up under sheepskin, layered wool, and whatever blanket-resembling thing Ulf the Knitter had recently invented. Imagine one massive pull-out couch, but made of wood, hay, and familial warmth, and possibly an uncle with an unshakable fondness for garlic. Now, you might think that sleeping in a room full of relatives, and possibly the family goat, sounds more chaotic than restful, but therein lies the trick. Viking sleep was not 8 uninterrupted hours of isolated slumber, but something softer, slower. They often practiced what we now call segmented sleep. People would drift off not once but twice. They'd nod off after dusk, wake around midnight to talk, ponder, recite poems, sneak in a romantic tussle, or perhaps fix their sock. Then they'd return to sleep until dawn. Imagine that, a whole extra hour just to sit and stare at a flickering oil lamp, wondering whether Thor ever caught colds. It was sleep, with an intermission, and it worked. The dark northern winters taught Vikings to move at the speed of firelight. Days were short, nights were long, stars arrived early, and the sun was often fashionably late. So instead of fighting against time, the Norse folk tucked neatly into it. They also had an unusually poetic relationship with bedtime. The Old Norse word for sleep, sverfen, sounds like you're swaddling yourself in a cloud shaped like the letter S. There were sagas filled with dream visions, some heroic, some profoundly odd. Take, for instance, the tale of a warrior who dreamed his sword turned into a fish, and the fish gave him financial advice. Somewhere between prophecy and a sleep-deprived metaphor, we're sure. And while we tend to seek out white noise machines these days, the Vikings had their own version of sleep sounds. The constant crackling of firewood, the lulling howl of wind against turf walls, and the comforting creak of the timber frame swaying slightly in a storm. It was like being rocked to sleep in the belly of a dragon, whose greatest crime was being extremely well insulated. Of course, there were the occasional interruptions, like Sven's habit of sleepwalking while muttering insults at the moon. But on the whole, the Viking approach to rest was equal parts practical and surprisingly tender. They'd sleep fully clothed, bundled in tunics and cloaks. They'd use soft woolen caps to keep warm, and their pillows, sometimes stuffed with straw, sometimes moss, sometimes feathers. Once, in a particularly ambitious archaeological dig, someone discovered a Viking pillow filled with reindeer hair. That's either deeply cozy or very itchy. Historians remain divided on the matter. As the fire dimmed and the longhouse sighed together like a great collective beast settling down for hibernation, there was a sense of earned comfort. The day's labor was behind them, and the storm outside could do its worst. Inside they had warmth, company, and a dream or two circling like ravens above the rafters. And somewhere, in the gentle rustle of wool and wood, a snore began, a slow, rhythmic declaration of total peace, the Viking lullaby. Next, we'll step just beyond the longhouse walls, where winter darkness held secrets about nighttime that even Odin might envy. The Vikings, of course, are best known for things like sailing across frozen seas without a travel agent, brandishing axes with names like Skull Splitter, and generally looking like extras from a Norse-themed heavy metal concert. But buried beneath the thundering raids and ale-fueled sagas is a far gentler truth. Something softer than sagas and cuddlier than chainmail. The Vikings absolutely knew how to get a good night's sleep. Their sleeping arrangements were, surprisingly, less about howling wolves and more about wool-stuffed comfort. Take the Viking longhouse, for example. It wasn't just a glorified wooden barn where everyone grunted beside cows and snoozed with a sword tucked under the pillow. No, the longhouse doubled as a surprisingly cozy collective nest. Families, pets, and even the occasional goat bedded down under the same sod roof, radiating warmth like a Norse space heater. The crackling hearth fire in the center of the longhouse never went out, producing more than just the scent of last week's stew. It gave off a sleepy hum, like an ancient ancestor of white noise machines. The Vikings didn't have ocean wave soundtracks or whale song CDs, but they had embers, flickering shadows, the occasional snore from Uncle Bjorn, and the gentle rustle of straw bedding. It turns out all of that was oddly soothing, if you ignore the possibility of a goat nibbling your hat in the dark. Now, Bedding itself was far more luxurious than one might expect from a people renowned for pillaging. Viking mattresses weren't filled with bricks and regrets. Instead, they stuffed them with straw, feathers, moss, or some glorious mixture of whatever was soft and wouldn't bite back. In fact, some wealthier Vikings even had pelts layered atop their beds, bearskin throws if they were lucky. And yes, possibly still a bit bear-scented. Clothing, too, served as bedtime finery. Vikings didn't have separate pajamas, but they did have cozy tunics made of wool, which, if you've ever slept in wool on a windy Scandinavian night, can feel like curling up inside a hot biscuit. Wool was their bedtime best friend. It breathed in the summer and insulated in the winter. It was basically the organic, locally sourced answer to climate-controlled bedding. And speaking of climate, let's whisper for a moment about the weather. Nights were long, especially in winter, quite literally. In parts of Viking-era Scandinavia, the sun would retreat for weeks on end, leaving behind the kind of sustained darkness that therapists today might call extreme, but Vikings called perfect napping conditions. They didn't fight the darkness. They leaned into it, sleeping more, working less, and possibly inventing the nap before it was cool. There's even some archaeological evidence to suggest the Vikings practiced biphasic sleep, that is, splitting the night's rest into two distinct segments. Imagine this. You fall asleep after nightfall, wake up a few hours later for a bit of low-lit chatting, perhaps some quiet whittling, or, if you're feeling cheeky, a romantic rendezvous in the hay, and then drift back off until sunrise decides to reappear around February. This gentle rhythm of wake sleep, matched the body's natural cycle beautifully. It was like nature's snooze button, timed by starlight instead of an app. Now, for all their drama and dragon ships, the Vikings didn't clutter their bedrooms or longhouses with mirrors or distracting decor. No glowing rectangles, no screens buzzing. The last time someone glanced at a glowing rectangle in Viking times, it was probably a runestone catching fire in a storm. Their evenings wound down with stories, lullabies, and sometimes, if Skald Eirik was in a particularly poetic mood, a saga about a sword that could sense when you were about to sneeze. And so, in spite of, or perhaps because of, the simplicity of Viking life, they achieved a sleep quality that would put modern humans to shame. No sleep apps, no blackout curtains delivered by drone, just wool, warmth, and the kind of darkness only available in places that honor the night like an old friend. Now, as the firelight of our Viking longhouse flickers low and the sounds of gentle breathing mix with the soft bristles of straw underfoot, one can't help but wonder, what dreams dance behind Viking eyelids? Did they see distant shores or mythic beasts? Or maybe, just maybe, they dreamt of something even rarer. The perfect nap calendar. But before your own ship sets sail into dreams, there's still another piece of this story settling into the twilight mist. The Viking day might end in woolen comfort, but what of the hours before then, when twilight stretched and sleep teased the edge of a blade? Let's slip a bit deeper into the dust together and find out. By the time the Viking sun dipped below the fjords of a crisp Scandinavian evening, casting dragon-prowed longboats in golden silhouette, it wasn't bloodlust or battle that filled the hearts of Norse families. It was bath time. Yes, bath time. That steamy, wooden-barreled ritual no one ever draws on the cover of Viking novels. A proper prelude to one of the most enviable sleep experiences in all of human history. You see, unlike many of their medieval contemporaries who feared water like it owed them money, Vikings were serial bathers. Archaeologists have turned up combs, tweezers, ear cleaners. Yes, tiny bronze spoons for removing ear gunk, the height of Viking chic, all suggesting that these folks were not just warriors, but well-groomed nappers. Saturdays, known then as longhouses, quite literally meaning bath day, were sacred. Not in a shh, don't talk in the sauna sort of way. Sauna day was likely every day, but ritually, socially, and sleepily significant. And this was no icy plunge into fjord water. Vikings heated rocks until they glowed like Thor's post-leg day calves, then dropped them with an expert splash into wooden tubs or dug out pits lined with hot stones. Toss on a bit of birch, some juniper, and you had Viking aromatherapy, the smoky sort that cleared the sinuses and sent even the burliest raider off into a yawn. Hot stones and steam did more than open pores. They opened pathways to deep, luxurious slumber. Sure, they didn't know it was due to thermoregulation and core body temperature shifts, but after a long day of swinging axes or churning butter, a hot soak soothed muscles and signaled the brain to prepare for sleep. Not battle, not pillaging, just shut-eye. And oh, did they soak. According to a slightly scandalized 13th century Englishman named John of Wallingford, the Vikings were too clean. By his account, they bathed every Saturday, scandalous, and combed their hair daily. He accused them of using their hygiene to seduce married women in Anglo-Saxon England. Truly, the scent of cedar-infused Viking might have been history's earliest sleep spray, equal parts seductive and soporific. Once the bath was done, and everyone was pink-cheeked and giggling from too much hot spruce, the evening settled into a rhythm of storytelling by the hearth. Candles of whale fat flickered, casting dancing shadows on timber walls carved with rune-like etchings and the occasional doodle of an axe with eyes, just in case swords were watching. The Viking home, low-ceilinged, turf-insulated, and far cozier than you'd expect for people who sailed stormy seas, was designed to trap warmth in and let the Nordic chills out. At night, families curled on thick mattresses made of straw or feathers, covered with pelt upon pelt. Sheep, bear, the occasional slightly judgy reindeer. Inside these soot-blackened longhouses, warmth radiated from a central hearth like a gentle heartbeat. Children snuggled beside parents. Cracked jokes would echo beneath wooden beams, and dreams likely took the form of slow-swaying pine trees or giant meals with no end. And then there was the bedtime brew. Not ale, mind you, though it's true, the Vikings knew their way around barley and fermentation. This was a gentler sip. Brewers would concoct herbal drinks made of heather, mugwort, or chamomile. Add a dash of honey, and you had yourself what may well be history's first sleepy time tea. Vikings, and perhaps all of us if we're lucky, understood something profound. To sleep well is not to indulge in laziness, but to armor oneself gently for the days to come. A hot bath, a good story, a shared blanket under the northern stars. All of it was ritual, sacred in its simplicity. And so, in the quiet of a starlit longhouse, after bathing and with nothing left to sharpen or stir, the only thing a Viking needed was the slow hush of breath, the settling creak of timber, and the sound of a house full of sleepy sighs. But, as it turns out, the walls of those homes may have held more secrets than just cozy warmth. There's a strange little detail about Viking pillows, but let's ease into that discovery, gently, like a reindeer onto fresh snow. As the longship swayed gently in the harbour mist, and the northern sky whispered lullabies made entirely of wind, there, tucked in his modest longhouse, lay Eric Fishtoes, so named not for any heroic deeds, but for his distractingly scented boots. Eric, like many Vikings of his sleepy settlement, had mastered the fine art of falling asleep faster than a goat could faint, which, if you've ever surprised a goat, is alarmingly fast. You see, by the 9th century, these Nordic folks had figured something out that modern mattress commercials can only dream of. Proper nighttime rituals. Yes, the same people who pioneered wartime axe fashion and mildly terrifying funerals on flaming boats were also connoisseurs of the bedtime routine. And no, it did not involve scrolling through glow sticks of doom, otherwise known as enchanted black rectangles of flickering runes. They didn't have those yet, just darkness and ale. Let's slide into the evening rhythm of a Viking household. Not too quickly now. We don't want to wake the house spirits. They're notoriously cranky before dusk. As twilight rolled in, the Vikings gathered not just their children, chickens, and woolen socks by the hearth, but their stories. Storytelling was the bedtime podcast of the Viking Age. Only instead of earbuds, they had Einar One Ear, named for reasons you may imagine. Einar spun tales of gods, giants, sea monsters, and surprisingly relatable farmers who traded livestock for love. These sagas were so epic, they had chapters before chapters were even trendy. And what were these fabled Vikings lying down on while listening to Einar drone on about Loki's latest escapade? Well, beds were not luxurious, but they were no planks on dirt either. Raised wooden platforms lined with pelts and straw sacks filled with hay or feathers provided both insulation and a gentle reminder that you may be sharing your mattress with a mildly curious mouse, sometimes more than one, especially during cheese season. As for pajamas, a long woolen tunic was sufficient, often the same one worn through the day. Vikings were busy people. They believed in the dual-purpose approach to life. If your nightshirt couldn't double as goat-herding couture by morning, then what were you even doing? And peace reigned in these homes, not just because the children were finally asleep, but because their architecture helped. Longhouses were cleverly designed with low ceilings that trapped heat and muffled sound. The thick sod roofing, made of turf and earth, not only kept snow at bay, but demonically silenced any hope of eavesdropping owls or overly chatty neighbors. Outside, the crackling lull of the hearth's dying fire was matched by the lapping waters of nearby fjords. It was the kind of gentle background noise that could cradle even the most battle-weary warrior into dreamland, where he might heroically misplace his sword, yet still win the admiration of someone named Freydis. One might wonder, did these Vikings not fear night attacks or mythical beasts in the shadows? Surprisingly, they slept well with their hopes high and their axes higher, often hanging above the bed, a kind of metal dream catcher, only slightly more aggressive. You never know when a troll might interrupt your REM cycle. Of course, not all midnight disturbances were of the trollish variety. Imagine, if you will, poor Bjorn Half-Thought, the forgetful herdsman, waking in a panic because he left a goat outside with the wolves. Again, his wife, Ingrid the Unamused, reminded him this was the third goat lost to moonlit negligence, and perhaps he was cursed by the god of misplaced livestock. But even those brief midnight dramas ended in sleep swiftly reclaimed, thanks to the sheer exhaustion of Viking life and the uncanny ability of northern wool to comfort both body and soul. With bellies warm from stew and hearts heavy from stories of old, the Norse folk didn't fight sleep. They embraced it like a long-lost cousin showing up to a feast with fermented herring. And so, the night drifted on, like a slow ship on a silver sea, where every breath was in rhythm with the land, until a rooster crowed prematurely and was met with the collective groan of a village not yet ready to face another day of battle, baking, or bog repair. But before we attend to those morning matters, or question why bog repair requires a full team and a backup shaman, let us drift deeper into the warmth of that sod-roofed night, where even Odin himself might yawn beneath the stars. In the chilly hush of a Scandinavian evening, far off from the clatter of modernity or the buzz of 24-hour notifications, Viking villages began their nightly routine. Longhouses glowed faintly through smoke holes, like sleepy beasts exhaling warmth into the cold dusk. And inside, the Vikings were readying for bed, not just with practicality, but with intention. Because if there's anything history has underappreciated, it's this. The Norse weren't just excellent at raiding and rowing and growing tremendous beards. They were also, quite possibly, the world champions of winding down. Now, that may sound surprising. Surely a Viking was some sort of berserk superhuman who slept with one eye open and an axe under the fur pillow. And sure, some of that is true, especially the axe part, which doubled as both security system and bedside table. But beneath the maybe slightly exaggerated ferocity of old sagas lies a secret the raiders rarely wrote down. These folks cherished their sleep like it was one of Odin's sacred treasures. Their evening rituals began quietly with tasks that signaled the day's end. The livestock were tucked away in adjoining stalls. Yes, in some longhouses, cows and goats got their own section indoors. That's not just practical for warmth. It's the coziest version of a sleep soundtrack you can imagine. Soft clucking, low moos, the occasional goat snore, like a Viking-shaped white noise machine. Dinner, which may have included hearty stews of barley, root vegetables, and slabs of salted fish, helped line stomachs with calories to fight off the cold. Afterward came storytelling, an unofficial substitute for television, except with more melodrama and significantly better names. Imagine being lulled to sleep as your father tells of Hrolfr the Walker outwitting trolls in the north, or your aunt spins a tale about how Thor's missing hammer was recovered with a disguise, a wedding veil, and a truly unforgettable feast. You try staying awake during Act 3 of a saga after a hot stew. But here's where things get especially cozy. Bedding. The sleeping arrangements in longhouses were ingeniously low maintenance, built for warmth and rest rather than decor. Platforms lined the inside walls, stuffed with straw or down, and topped with furs softer than a fjord breeze. Think of them as primitive memory foam with a charming hint of barnyard. People slept communally, huddled for warmth, sometimes with the family dog curled up at their ankles. Kids practiced the noble art of blanket hogging even then, and some traditions never change. The longhouse was a dim, smoke-filled lullaby in timber form. A single hearth sat in the center, smouldering steadily, its embers casting shadows that danced like old gods on the walls. The smoke rose through the thatch and drifted lazily back down, coating everything in a faint scent of peat and pine resin. Sleep came gently in this setting, not as a thing chased, but something that arrived naturally, in the timeless hush after firelight. No clocks ticking, no Sirius XM, no emails, just the rhythm of livestock, the crackle of ash, and the sense that tomorrow could wait its turn. It wasn't just the physical setting that made Viking sleep sublime. It was the relationship to rest itself. Nights weren't squandered in last-minute productivity sprints or over-caffeinated existential spirals. They were sacred pauses. Sleep was a part of life's balance, necessary for strength, for wit, for navigating icy seas or navigating your wife's reaction to yet another drinking horn purchase. Even the gods were good sleepers. Odin dozed in deep magical slumbers to commune with hidden wisdom. Freyr had dreams foretelling prosperity, and Thor slumbered deeply between adventures. Although judging by his snoring, he may have led Asgard's loudest midnight symphonies. Sleep, for the Vikings, was a vital, revered thing, woven into storytelling, kinship, architecture, and belief. And that, more than mead or muscle, might have been the true source of their power. The mythic 8 hours. Outside, snow began to fall softly, landing on the thatch roofs and muffling the sounds of a slowing world. Inside, one by one, they slipped beneath woolen blankets into the arms of dreams and sagas not yet finished. Cozy as a contented goat, we now drift onward into greater mysteries still resting under fur-lined covers, waiting patiently just ahead. Picture, if you will, the dim orange glow of whale oil lamps flickering along the wooden beams of a longhouse buried beneath a blanket of northern snow. Outside, a gust of wind whispers secrets to the pine trees, secrets about old gods and last season's fish prices. But within, inside that warm, timbered belly of Viking domestic life, a certain hush has settled. It is the hush of contented slumber, interrupted only by the creak of fur-covered bodies shifting on straw mattresses, plus the occasional gentle snore that sounds like a walrus humming in its sleep. Tonight, we find ourselves peering into the private world of Viking slumber customs. Because for people often remembered for raiding, pillaging, and inventing boat-based team building, they were surprisingly meticulous about their bedtime. First, there's the matter of architecture. Viking homes, particularly longhouses, were vast wooden rectangles shared with extended families, livestock, and the odd 14-year-old who insisted he'd seen a Draugr near the outhouse. They were constructed with earth-insulated walls and turf-covered roofs, which kept warmth inside almost as effectively as your grandmother's favorite casserole dish. The hearth, that central fire pit, burned low through the night, not roaring, but murmuring. Like it too, was half asleep. It gently radiated heat, enough to toast faces and keep fingers from freezing, but not enough to turn your cowhide pillow into a cautionary tale about heat damage. Now let's talk bedding. While Vikings weren't exactly reclining on plush memory foam, they weren't savages when it came to bedtime textiles either. Straw mattresses, often filled with dried reeds, feathers, or seaweed. Yes, seaweed, which is apparently just spongy enough to lie on without immediately rethinking your life choices, were layered with woolen blankets and fur throws. These weren't your average squirrel pelts, mind you. We're talking sheepskins, bear hides, and anything else that had once said bah or grrr and looked cuddly when asleep. Clothing doubled as pajamas. And really, why not? If you've worn a tunic all day, and it feels vaguely like someone spun a cloud from goat hair and righteous conquest, why not keep it on for a nap? Besides, slipping into something more comfortable would require additional garments, and textiles took effort. Spinning, weaving, dyeing, these weren't just hobbies. In Viking society, that was basically launching your own Etsy shop. And then there's the sleeping arrangement itself. Many Vikings slept communally, families nestling together like spoons in a carved wooden drawer. This was practical. Warmth, protection, and the sheer ease of gossiping until everyone drifted into unconsciousness. You can imagine the muffled exchanges from under fur blankets. Did you hear Eric fell into a fjord again? He always does. Bless him, sleeps like driftwood. Of course, every household was different. Wealthier families had more privacy, often separated sleeping alcoves curtained off with tapestries, a luxurious chance to snore in semi-private. And yes, snoring was likely common, given the no-nonsense diet of dried fish, barley gruel, pickled things, and the occasional mead-enhanced soliloquy. Speaking of mead, oh yes, it certainly played a role in the Viking wind-down routine. A hearty glug of honey-based alcohol at the end of the day didn't just celebrate surviving another round of axe-based disagreements. It also had a relaxing effect. Full bellies, warm fires, and a buzz light enough to make even your neighbor's goat look charming. This was the Viking version of sleep hygiene. But sleep was not just seen as practical. It had a touch of the sacred too. In Norse cosmology, dreams were sometimes believed to offer glimpses into other realms. Dreams could be messages from the gods, or even the wandering journeys of your soul. Falling asleep wasn't just a physical act. It was potentially stepping into realms where Odin might drop by and offer unsolicited life coaching. Which brings us to that curious Viking habit of placing carved wooden figures or little charms by the bedside. These sleep guardians, often depicting protective deities or ancestors, were the night shift staff of the spiritual world, keeping bad dreams and dark spirits at bay. Think of them as teddy bears with job descriptions. So, with their bellies warmed by fish stew, their faces glowing in lamplight, and their straw-filled mattresses nestled amongst family limbs and faded furs, the Vikings surrendered to rest. Some dreamed of Valhalla feasts. Others probably just dreamed of finally not stepping on another rogue goat turd on the way to the latrine. Either way, slumber in the Viking world was sacred, social, and snuggled. And tomorrow, when the morning light lifted softly across the fjords and filtered in past the antler racks and shield pegs, life would begin again. Axe, cloak, wind, and wool. But for now, the fire burns low, and the longhouse breathes as one. Let's see who else in the Viking world took their sleep a little too seriously. As the wind howled quietly outside a longhouse tucked into a mossy slope of 10th century Norway, the Vikings, yes, those sword-swinging enthusiasts of rugged fashion, were blissfully unaware that future insomniacs would one day marvel at their superior sleep routines. Among the many secrets the Vikings never set out to keep, like how to make a funeral boat extra flammable, there was one aspect they absolutely mastered without trying: sleeping better than the rest of human history combined. Let's gently push open the carved wooden door of a Viking sleep chamber. Not a palace, mind you, but far cozier. Most Viking homes had a single multi-purpose room, like a studio apartment with a lot more fur and a lot fewer inspirational slogans. On one end, cooking fire. In the center, benches and a table. And at the far sides, sleeping platforms, family beds piled with the hay, wool-stuffed mattresses, and perhaps a cat or two who'd claimed squatting rights. Contrary to the axe-heavy reputations of their daytime activities, Vikings understood sleep as a shared, necessary ritual. You either slept well or fought poorly. And any self-respecting Viking would prefer the second thing never happen. What's more, their houses were intentionally built low to the ground and tight as a mead barrel, keeping heat in and nighttime worries quietly out. And speaking of heat, forget central heating. Viking comfort was powered by radiant sheep, layers of wool, animal skins, and occasionally each other provided the insulation necessary for drifting off into the fjord-kissed equivalent of REM. Plus, nestled with family, and sometimes extended family and their goats, it's hard not to find a rhythm to the shared breathing and snoring. Think of it as ancient surround snooze. Now, if you're wondering why they didn't toss and turn worrying about taxes or unread emails, remember, their concerns were deliciously elemental. Will the fish smoke properly for winter storage? Is that owl hoot an omen or just an owl? Did Uncle Einar finish patching the roof with birch bark? Or will it leak straight onto my forehead again tonight? Worries, yes, but manageable ones. Tangible, not existential spreadsheets. Before bed, many Viking households engaged in storytelling. Not the kind involving dragons with highly specific tax advice. These were oral histories, sagas passed down by parents, grandparents, and whichever cousin had the loudest voice. Tales of gods, giants, doomed love, and triumph over frosty adversity. The effect? A cultural lullaby, heroic, rhythmic, and packed with names like Olaf Hairy Breeches. In a world without backlit screens or symphonic appliances humming into the void, oral stories were emotional sedatives. And while their days were often energetic, axe maintenance was, in its own way, cardio. The nights were quiet, candle-lit, and soot-soft. Lamps made from hollowed stones filled with oily fish fat glowed dimly in corners, casting shadows that flickered and danced like old Norse spirits stretching before bed. There was, charmingly enough, an unhurried kindness to their nights. You didn't grab a nap. You let sleep roll in like a gentle fog across the fjord. You didn't crash out on the haystack. You tucked yourself in like salted cod in linen. Dreaming was a form of travelling, the only kind where you always came back with all your limbs. And if you ever needed help dozing off, the Norse had the answer: spells. Sleep charms were part of the culture, ever so slightly magical, muttered in rhythmic verses, not unlike a guided meditation, but with more references to Thor. One popular lullaby likely translated to something like, "Sleep now, bone-weary wanderer, lest the trolls steal your boots at dawn," which is truly the Norse way of saying, "Sweet dreams." So they slept, deeply, collectively, beneath turf roofs and stars that twinkled through smoke holes in the ceiling. The lull of wind against wooden beams, the occasional warmth of mead reviving the senses before slumber took over entirely. And somewhere in that permafrost cradle of civilization, nestled under firs and beside glowing peat fires, Viking dreams unfurled, slow, steady, and sky-wide. Of course, not everything about bedtime in the Norse world was as innocent as it seemed. You see, just over the sea, something rather unexpected was brewing. Something that involved monks, very early wake-up calls, and a collection of bells destined to be too loud for any decent dream. Night in the Viking Age didn't fall. It wrapped itself like a woolen cloak around longhouses and fjords, quieting the clanking of swords and the boisterous mead songs into a muffled hush. By twilight, the sea turned to black silk. The air smelled faintly of smoke and pine, and the world grew softer. Even the longships seemed to rest their dragon heads more gently on the lapping shore, as if they, too, required a solid 8 hours. And the Vikings, they didn't just sleep. No, they retired for the evening with a flair somewhere between a Shakespearean actor and a contented cat. While we might cling to our memory foam and white noise apps, the average Norse sleeper settled beneath furs so thick, if you dropped your axe in there, you might not find it till spring. Let's take a gentle step into the longhouse. Picture a sturdy wooden building, 40 feet long or longer, mostly built from timber and the occasional reused ship plank, because why waste a good hull? Inside, the fire pit glows low and warm, still flickering from the evening supper, where fish with names we dare not try to pronounce were grilled over flame and shared in clattering joy. The fire, you see, was central to Viking sleep, not just because it looked good on a cold Scandinavian Instagram, but because it actually kept you from freezing solid. Homes in Viking times weren't exactly draft-free. The walls were thick, sure, often insulated with turf, wattle, and the laborious hopes that the wind would take a night off. But still, the fire was the warm heart of the house. And who slept where? Ah, the delightful game of guess who's snoring. Most Viking households all bunked together, family, servants, and sometimes, inexplicably, the goat. They piled up along the edges of the longhouse, usually on raised wooden platforms built over storage compartments. Efficiency was key. Your bed was also a seat, a bench, a hiding place for smuggled cheese, and occasionally a step stool. What did they use for bedding? Glad you asked. Layer upon layer of straw, heather, or hay was the base. An organic mattress that crunched like granola with each toss and turn. Over this, woolen blankets, animal pelts, and hand-woven linens were stacked, creating nests so warm they would put modern duvets to shame. And nestled beneath all this, people in tunics and braque, often snuggling quite innocently for warmth. After all, central heating was still a good 1,000 years away from being invented, and affection makes an excellent insulator. Interestingly, Viking sleep followed a pattern more natural than ours, what modern science now calls segmented sleep. Many people in the Viking world slept in two distinct phases, separated by a period of wakefulness in the middle of the night. So they'd sleep a few hours, wake up for a bit, pray, talk, have a snack, sharpen a blade, hopefully not near the bed, then fall back asleep until dawn. It was a rhythm that mirrored nature, rather than fighting it with espresso and alarm clocks. Of course, the nighttime wasn't all quiet breathing and fire crackle lullabies. Sometimes people had a story to share or a saga to recite. Storytelling was, in fact, the Viking version of binge-watching. Gathered under the same hairy blanket, someone might recount the long-winded tale of Thor losing his hammer and dressing in drag to get it back. Yes, that is a real Norse myth, and everyone would laugh or pretend to, lest they offend the storyteller, who may also be your aunt, and notably good with a spear. Melatonin, as it turns out, is not as mighty as a calming recitation of your ancestors' dramatic adventures. But sleep wasn't just recovery to Vikings, it had spiritual heft. Dreams, they believed, were glimpses into the other worlds. Odin himself often communicated through dreams, sending a raven to tangle your thoughts just enough to make you question whether marrying that sheep herder 3 fjords over was really a wise move. Dream interpreters were a respected lot, especially when they could tell which visions were divine and which were caused by eating half a fermented trout too late in the evening. And when morning finally arrived, sunlight filtered in through holes in the thatched roof and cracks in the wood, painting golden stripes across the furrowed faces of warriors and weavers alike. Roosters? Optional. The real alarm clock was the smoke beginning to rise again from the rekindled fire, and the distant thud of early risers already chopping wood like it owed them money. But before we wake entirely, let us drift just a bit longer in the warm shadows of that Viking longhouse, where the cold is held at bay by fire and fur, and the snoring is a kind of lullaby all its own. The goats may stir soon, but there's still time, just a little, before the day demands anything more than dreaming. Let us linger here, as the longhouse sleeps still, heavy with quiet breath and ancient peace, gently turning the page toward what lies beyond the firelight, as the woolen fog of twilight would settle over the fjords Our Viking friends often found themselves gravitating toward a marvel of domestic architecture that we, in the modern day, might call cozily aggressive. You see, long before thermostats and electric blankets, before memory foam heated mugs and podcasts about memory foam heated mugs, the Vikings had perfected the art of sleeping in what can only be described as the snuggle fortress. This wonder of sleep-inducing engineering was known as the longhouse, a simple name for a place designed to survive howling storms, wandering livestock, low-stakes Viking drama, and yes, the eternal Scandinavian cold. Imagine a vast wooden hull flipped upside down, padded with turf, timber, and big feelings. A longhouse was just that, long, often over 75 feet from mushy end to smoky end. The walls, thick with wattle and daub, were bolstered with layers of earth and sod, like a hobbit had finally given up and gone full Viking. These weren't just buildings, they were warm, wooden wombs of civilization. And every night, under those sod-laden roofs, small communities of kin would settle into sleep, like potatoes tucking into rich soil. But this wasn't just about architecture. No, the Viking sleep secret lived in the rhythm and rituals that pulsed within those draft-blocked walls. The hearth, sweet centerpiece of Viking domestic bliss, glowed steadily, like the warm gaze of an old friend with an impressive beard. Fire, carefully tended through the night, provided both heat and a hypnotic lullaby of crackling logs. This gentle sizzle, perhaps wood's one contribution to the ASMR genre, was joined by the wheezing snores of elders, the bedtime mutterings of children describing spear fights, and the practical lull of livestock shifting just beyond the inner threshold. Yes, you heard that correctly. Cows, pigs, sheep. Depending on the wealth and weather, your average Viking home was delightfully interspecies after sunset. The livestock often shared the dwelling, huddled in stalls along the walls, their body heat rising into the shared air like a bovine contribution to central heating. The result? An ambient warmth few medieval societies ever achieved, a kind of slow-cooked coziness. And if you've never slept beside a goat named Hilda, while wrapped in sheepskin, well, don't knock it, till you've dozed off on a bed of straw with your toes toasting near a pig. Their beds, if you could call them that, were simple wooden or stone platforms, cushioned with hay, moss, or if you were fancy, a mattress stuffed with down, shared by couples, children, perhaps an elderly uncle named Bjorn, who told the same tale every night. They were snuggle zones of necessity and tradition. Personal space was not so much a right, as it was a mythical beast some poet once sang about, and then dropped the idea mid-saga. And before you ask, yes, they told stories. Vikings weren't just about raids and rowing. They revered sharp minds and sharper tongues. The saga culture reigned strong, and fireside tales punctuated with dramatic pauses and long silences were the stuff sleepy dreams were woven from. Nothing gently smothered a restless mind quite like the droning tale of how your great-great-uncle defeated a sea monster using only a spoon and deep emotional repression. Now, let's talk of linens, which, for clarity, were neither particularly linen nor luxurious, but they were cleverly warm. Layer upon layer of fur, wool, felted cloaks, and the occasional bearskin gave sleepers the weighted comfort of being gently attacked by kindness. Even Viking children were wrapped like little cinnamon rolls in the wool swaddles, tucked tight against wandering drafts and the occasional errant chicken. Interestingly, sleep wasn't one tidy 8-hour stretch. The Vikings, like many pre-industrial peoples, experienced first sleep and second sleep, 2 chambers of rest with a dreamy intermission between. During the dark center of the night, someone might wake, stir the fire, step outside to gaze at the moon, or quietly whisper to the gods. It wasn't insomnia, it was intermission. A contemplative pause in the night's opera, a time to reflect, release a sheep back outside, or make sure that Uncle Bjorn hadn't rolled into the fireplace again. Yes, the longhouse life was wrapped in wool and woven in wonder, and beneath its gabled tranquility, generations sank into slumber so complete, the Norse word for dreaming, drauma, still sounds like a long exhale into the fjord's mist. In the end, it wasn't just the beds or the fire, or even the polite proximity of pigs. It was the ensemble of shared warmth, deep storytelling, and a rhythm so in tune with nature, even the stars were on their side. And just as the embers softly dimmed and stories curled like smoke over sleeping heads, something curious began stirring along the coasts of the Isles. But that quiet mystery can wait, as all good dreams do, until next time. By the glow of firelight, somewhere deep within a Viking longhouse insulated with turf and dreams, lay a scene that would make even modern sleep experts clutch their ergonomic pillows with envy. But tonight, we're not examining moss or mead. No, tonight, we venture into one of the lesser-known yet surprisingly vital ingredients in Viking slumber, bedtime stories. Yes, the Norsemen, often imagined as sword-swinging, fjord-splashing warriors, were also enthusiastic purveyors of the original Netflix, storytelling. Only instead of binge-watching dramas about Viking life, they just told them, out loud, with inflection, possibly while knitting socks out of goat wool. The long winter nights of Scandinavia didn't just encourage extra hours of hibernation, they demanded them. So before drifting off into deep, dreamless sleep, entire families would gather under shared pelts, heads cozy against hay-stuffed pillows, to listen to what were known as sagas. These weren't just bedtime filler. They were epics, sprawling tales of love, betrayal, honor, and the occasional poetic beheading. And they helped people fall asleep faster than any herbal tea known to history. Contrary to popular belief, not all sagas were blood-soaked odysseys full of swordplay and icewind duels. Some were tender recollections of ancestors. Some were moral tales disguised as gossip. Some, honestly, were just downright boring, but firmly in that delightful, sleep-inducing way. The kind of stories with lengthy descriptions of cloud movement and goat migration patterns. A favorite in some households. And don't look surprised. Ancient goat logistics can be strangely soothing. The role of the bedtime teller was of prime importance. Often, an elder would deliver the stories, someone whose voice had the timbre of ancient pine and whose sentence structure could lull wolves into unconsciousness. They would stretch out vowels like wool being spun, their rhythm syncing with the slow breathing of a household settling in under a sky weighed down by stars and snow. Now, why tell stories at night? Firstly, it passed the time. Have you ever tried surviving the 18-hour darkness of a Nordic winter without electricity, central heating, or a podcast? Secondly, it reinforced cultural memory. These tales preserved the genealogy of families, the do's and don'ts of trolls, and which fjords were haunted by particularly chatty spirits. But perhaps most importantly, to our sleep studies department, it gave the mind something warm to hold on to. In much the same way you might input Rain Sounds Volume 3 into your headphones tonight, a young Norse child might drift into slumber to the murmured tale of Aud the Deep-Minded and her clever escape via cleverly timed shipbuilding. In terms of acoustics, Viking sleeping situations benefited from what can only be described as maximum whisper resonance. The wooden walls, while not soundproof, had good acoustical bounce. Blankets, fur, and bodies packed in close helped muffle ambient noise. And all over the house, there were the familiar sleepy sounds of livestock. Chickens nesting in the far corner, a goat snoring gently near the chimney, a piglet dreaming of acorns, all of which merged into the ambient background soundscape. Call it Viking village white noise. Some longhouses were even constructed with small central fire pits that glowed quietly through the night, guarded by a half-sleeping adult. That orange flicker rolling across the beams served as an ancient version of a nightlight, albeit with an added risk of your beard catching fire if you rolled too close. But safety concerns aside, there's something deeply comforting about listening to an epic story by flame flicker, wrapped in wool, while a bard recites your great-great-grandfather's cow theft escapades. And these stories would linger. Sleep in the Viking world wasn't just unconsciousness. It was a gateway to the supernatural. Dreams carried weight, purpose. People believed dreams could deliver messages, visitations from gods or forebears, warnings from the unknowable forces of fate. What you fell asleep thinking about might just sneak into your dreams in a fur-lined cloak, so you'd nod off, full of warm broth, half-remembered verses, and the mildly uncomfortable sensation of sharing one plank bed with 3 siblings and a goose. And as your thoughts untethered from the waking world, the last thing you'd hear was a voice, soft and unhurried, unfurling a tale as old as snow. In the silence that followed, there was nothing but embers and the shuffle of dreaming feet. But just beyond the heavy curtain of sleep, a different kind of dream, involving astronomy, and a stunning amount of moss. Now, let's drift up the Norwegian coast, where a certain Viking family, let's call them the Snorresons, were famous not for their daring raids or navigational genius, but for something far more enviable: their luxurious, scandalously restful sleep. Their secret? An architecture of coziness engineered with more wisdom than a barrel of skaldic poems. While most imagine Vikings crammed into smoky longhouses filled with hay, mead, and mild disagreements about who left the axe out in the rain again, the Snorresons made a few delightful tweaks to their domestic setup that historians still puzzle over. For starters, the Snorreson longhouse was built with a bow-shaped frame, arched like a ship turned upside down. This wasn't unusual. Plenty of Viking homes resembled grounded vessels, but the Snorresons went a step further. They had double walls, stuffed generously with wool and straw. Not just any straw, mind you. They used the finest oat straw, meticulously dried and turned weekly. This kept the house toasty in winter and cool in the faint golden shivers of northern summer. But the real innovation was airflow. Most Viking homes relied on a hearth in the center and a hole in the roof for smoke to escape, often resulting in homes as smoggy as a 1990s London jazz club. The Snorresons, however, figured out how to angle vents along the eaves so warm air circulated gently. It was, in effect, central heating before the concept of central, or heating, had even been named. This meant their beds, tucked into deep alcoves lined with fur and flaxen cloth, never felt damp or drafty. Their beds were more like cocoons, with wooden walls on 3 sides and thick curtains, woven by nimble fingers aged by storytelling and goat herding. Some even had murals painted inside the alcoves, constellations for children to drift off beneath, or pastoral mountain scenes for the elders. who'd spent enough time looking at real fjords and preferred the painted kind by that point. Young Egil, the tousled-haired son with a habit of eating dried apples before bed, called his bed the boat that sails to dreamland. Every evening, he crawled into it with a bedtime saga spoken in rhyme, sometimes by his grandmother, who was 84, but still wore her beard with pride and could recite the genealogy of every sheep they'd ever owned. Now, you might ask, where did they even get such luxuriously soft bedding in 9th century Scandinavia? The answer comes in layers. First, eider down, harvested delicately from the nests of the common eider duck, whose feathers were said to be softer than Loki's lies and warmer than Thor's temper. Collecting it required stealth and reverence. Snorreson children were taught to tiptoe through the marshes without waking a single duck, the world's quietest game of hide and seek. Then came the linen sheets, woven from flax grown in their field, a labor of love considering flax processing resembles nothing less than polite wrestling with plant fibers for several weeks. But the finished result was worth it. Soft, breathable, cool in summer, and warm in winter. And of course, there was wool, felted, brushed, and layered in magnificent quantities into quilts so thick they could put a grown ox to sleep. When sleep finally came, it did so with such contentment that time itself seemed to exhale. The bones of the longhouse creaked with the wood sigh. Embers glowed like sleepy constellations on the hearth. Outside, snow fell in leisurely spirals, and not a soul turned restlessly in their sleep. Even their dreams were finely tuned. No chaotic wanderings or chasing geese through cloud-covered forests. Instead, calm sagas unfurled under their eyelids, of friendly dragons teaching poetry, of butter churns that sang lullabies, and once, memorably, of a particularly philosophical walrus named Hrolf, who made excellent arguments about napping being the highest form of wisdom. Visitors to the Snorreson home often left baffled by how quickly they fell asleep in guest beds. One traveling merchant swore the pillows were enchanted, and another, a Christian monk, wept tears of joy and promptly wrote a psalm about it, now lost to history, but presumably titled Ode to Resteth Greatly. And so, in between trading trips to Shetland and spirited debates about whether helmets needed horns, they didn't. The Snorresons maintained a quiet monopoly on the art of perfect sleep. Their two unwritten commandments: respect the ducks and never underestimate the power of a well-fluffed pillow. And as the longhouse dimmed beneath its moss-laden roof, and a wolf howled distantly like someone singing reluctantly at a wedding, all was still. Nearly still enough to hear the slow, dreamy creak of a sleepboat drifting gently toward midnight, where a whole new dream was just about to arrive, quietly paddling across the fjord of the subconscious. If you had tiptoed past the fjords of late Viking age Scandinavia, say around the 11th century, you might find a curious sight just outside a turf-roofed longhouse. A Viking farmer lying flat on his back in the grass at midday, eyes closed, looking utterly at peace. You'd be forgiven for assuming he had either perished from too much mead or perhaps dramatically oversold his own story during the last round of skaldic poetry. But no, he was simply napping, efficiently, boldly, publicly. It was not weakness. In fact, among Viking communities, such midday rest was almost an art form. You see, Vikings didn't just conquer lands and decorate their longships with dragons. They had the good sense to honor a universal human truth. Noon is a terrible time to do anything strenuous. Even Odin himself, had he worked a full morning hauling peat or haggling over herring prices, likely would have approved of a short rest beneath a birch tree. And the Norse word dögurdamal, referring to the time between the morning and evening meals, was often when the villagers slowed down, not unlike the purring lull of a village cat curling near the hearth. But rest in Viking times wasn't purely functional. It was, in a curious way, communal. The longhouses were carefully tilted towards sociable sleeping. Picture a large rectangular room framed with sturdy wooden beams, the walls padded with wool tapestries to muffle outside winds and keep the warmth from the fire trapped within like a cozy secret. Everyone slept in a single room. Men, women, children, ghosts, chickens. And yet, everyone had their own little sleep nook, defined by fur blankets, carved wooden chests, and perhaps a stray axe or two repurposed as a bedtime companion. Against the odds, it was comfortable. And yes, even the ghosts eventually learned to whisper. Surprisingly, this domestic proximity sometimes created more dreams than dramas. The Norse had stories, after all, in which our dreams were portals used by the gods to deliver cryptic messages, like, "Don't go across the fjord tomorrow," or "Maybe stop eating that suspicious cheese." Dream interpretation wasn't a novelty, it was nighttime news. This meant that in between dreams of golden halls or frost giants doing cartwheels, Vikings likely woke up to discuss the meaning of it all over oatcakes and fish soup. And if you're thinking, but surely snoring in a communal longhouse must have been a ferocious ordeal, you are correct. The sagas may omit this detail, but the nighttime chorus of warriors, elders, and overfed sheep probably rivaled the thunder of Mjolnir. But sleep historians, yes, they do exist, tell us that this kind of sleeping, where people drifted in and out, often rising after a first sleep for a quiet moment of reflection, or maybe even a quick snack, was completely normal. These were segmented sleeps, the elegant dance of slumber before artificial lighting came in and bulldozed the rhythm flat. Interestingly, even the architecture seemed to whisper bedtime lullabies. Longhouses were built low and insulated not just for warmth, but for peace. The sod and timber walls tempered the storm's howls, turning them into gentle night music. It was Charles Dickens, much later, who would write of night winds as the gentle breathing of the world, but the Vikings already knew that sometimes sleep comes best when the outside world hums just softly enough to make you feel small in a comforting way. And lest you think our Viking friends guarded their dreams too modestly, there are runic inscriptions from combs, swords, and stones that speak of sleep, some even laced with gentle wishes. "Sleep well," one scratched message says. Not a command, but a hope, which may be the most Viking sentiment of all. Not charging into sleep, sword raised, but settling into it the way a ship meets still water. So the next time you huff and puff your way through a restless 3 a.m. tossing session, remember the Viking lying flat among the whispering grasses, fearless not only in battle but in rest. He probably had a dream to tell you about, something involving a goat, a fjord, and perhaps an enchanting woman with suspiciously good hair. But for now, the fire in the hearth is drawing down to a settled orange glow, and sleep is once again on the march, armored not in chainmail, but in contented sighs. Soon we journey northward still, where icy winds meet blankets stitched with careful hands. As dusk draped its woolen shawl over the fjords and smoke curled like sleepy serpents from sod-roofed Viking homes, something unusually serene would settle across the settlements. It was not just the stillness of nightfall, nor entirely the mead working its theatrical magic. It was the quiet, coordinated symphony of sleep in a world where rest was considered not a luxury, but a sacred art. Tonight, let us drift softly through the threshold of a Viking longhouse, past timber beams blackened by age and hearth, and into the sleep habits of the Norse notables, chieftains, poets, and even the odd berserker who'd finally burned off his rage for the day. You might expect such warriors with names like Skull Splitter or Goat Hewer to simply collapse in a fur-strewn corner. On the contrary, these were people of surprising ritual. Consider the beds first. Crafted from sturdy oak or pine, they stood high above the earth floor, not just for comfort, but for warmth, and possibly to assert dominance over the family goat. These box beds weren't just for sprawling. They were enclosed, curtained, private. The sides reached up like walls, wrapped with wool or linen, and within lay thick layers of animal skins and textiles. Picture sleeping in something between a cradle and a personal cabin. Warm, protective, slightly scented of yesterday's stew. Oh, and possibly guarded by a runestone or a well-carved troll. Nightwear was evidently not the Viking strong suit. Tunics and trousers were kept simple. Wool base layers reimagined nightly as sleepwear. The real brilliance lay not in the fashion, but the functionality. The dense Norwegian night had no intention of being gentle, and so the Vikings were, simply put, too warm to worry. And then we arrive at my personal favourite, bedroom gossip in Viking Iceland. There, it was customary for guests to share beds with hosts. Not in a salacious sense, though let's be fair, these were passionate people, but rather as a mixture of hospitality and thermal logistics, what we might today call unusual or deeply violating of my personal space. They considered part of good manners and basic heat preservation. It's a strong move. Show up, compliment the stew, and cozy up with Uncle Bjorn in the same pallet. However, as lovely as those longhouse cuddles may sound, the Vikings weren't immune to sleep dilemmas. Dreams, for instance, were something carefully observed and interpreted. If you dreamt of wolves, you might become a warrior. If you dreamt of knitting hats with your dead grandmother, well, probably best not to mention that one too loudly at breakfast. Wives and husbands, bound by duty and mutual familiarity with sheep bedding, often slept together, but could also take turns keeping first watch. Night was dangerous after all. Not every sound outside was a goat with poor boundaries. Raiders, bears, and disgruntled trolls on their midnight walkabouts made a good night's sleep something one might share in shifts. There was also the custom of sleep-talking poetry, called kenningar, small riddling metaphors murmured by the firelight. These were little couples' competitions, a sweet, sleepy duel of metaphor-laced verses about swords, seas, and sometimes, surprisingly, cheese. A man might describe his love as the mead of calmest fjords, and receive a reply such as, "And you, the helmet of my heart's wise goat." Romance, thy name is confusing livestock imagery. And of course, the ambient sounds of Viking slumber played their part. The rhythmic hiss of the hearth, the soft snufflings of livestock dozing a respectful few feet away, and somewhere in the rafters, the hoot of a watchful owl named, presumably, something like Gorm. All this to say, sleep was not merely physical recovery. It was a social contract, one where furs were shared, tales were spun, insults freshly retired, and dreams dressed in bear fur cloaks. And now, as our own eyes begin to soften at the edges, and our breath deepens like a fjord in moonlight, let us tiptoe gently past the fire as it settles into embers. Ahead, the mysteries still deepen. There are whispers of midnight baths and lullabies sung to the sea. But for now, let the fur pillow settle. Let your limbs surrender. The tale will continue where the tide next docks. It's worth imagining a small coastal village in the early spring, somewhere along the Norwegian fjords, around the year 870. Snow still clings to the hills like a forgetful guest overstaying its welcome. But inside the longhouse, puffing up from the central hearth, a sleepy blanket of wood smoke gently curls toward the rafters. Flickers of amber light wander over braided flax blankets, carved wall posts, and the slightly lumpy, snoring figures bundled in animal pelts. Now, among all the curious and oddly endearing customs of the Norse peoples, perhaps none have aged more beautifully than one simple, deliberate act, the pre-bedtime story circle. Yes, long before the rise of streaming platforms or the tyranny of doom scrolling, Viking households wrapped themselves not in algorithms, but in stories, often repeated, sometimes exaggerated, occasionally featuring trolls, and always reassuringly familiar. The sagas weren't just reserved for skalds near royal halls. Even in tiny hamlets, the oral tradition had a stronghold. And quite unintentionally, these tales were the original sleep podcasts. Picture it. After a day spent farming, foraging, fishing, or fending off suspiciously persistent neighbors from the next valley over, a family would gather around the hearth. Elders would lean in, children would slowly cease fidgeting, and someone would begin. Perhaps old Brynhilde with the generous eyebrows and a memory like a steel trap lubricated with honeyed mead. The voice would rise and fall, sometimes imitating a cantankerous giant, other times slowing to a hush so low it seemed the smoke itself might be listening. These moments weren't strictly for entertainment, though given the Viking sense of humor, they weren't short of laughs. There are, for example, actual recorded insults like, "You were a mare last night and I rode you hard." Delightfully rude, deeply poetic, and alarmingly effective. No, storytelling served a crucial communal function. It marked the shift from wakefulness to rest. The tales themselves, whether of Thor's bungling attempts to retrieve his hammer or the dreamy exploits of distant ancestors, weren't just epic poetry. They were collective lullabies. And there was an art to timing, the ending just as eyelids drooped. The master storyteller of a village, like a conductor coaxing the final sustained note from a drowsy orchestra, knew precisely when to let silence stretch across the chamber. A well-timed sigh, a low chuckle, and then nothing but the soft settling of woolen garments and the occasional creak of a wooden beam responding to the heat. Of course, their version of a bedtime snack wasn't exactly chamomile tea and shortbread. Those fortunate enough might enjoy some dried berries with curdled goat's milk, or a bit of smoked fish smeared on flatbread. Not conventionally sleep-inducing, perhaps, but heavy enough to encourage a post-digestive nap. And the effect? Well, beyond the biological benefits of full bellies and fire-warm toes, there was something profoundly comforting in knowing that your day ended as it had countless nights before, in company, in story, with laughter and legend blurring gently into dreams. It's no wonder they slept like oiled logs among the coals. Even the layout of the longhouse contributed to this shared tranquility. Sleeping areas weren't isolated rooms, but communal bunks or alcoves partitioned by curtains or hastily hung cloth. Privacy was more theoretical than actual, yet the presence of others, trusted family, familiar sounds, acted like a living security blanket. The crackle of the fire, the soft breathing of siblings, the groan of old wood easing into the chilled night, it all became part of an ambient Norse lullaby. And should sleep not come easy, well, one could count runes instead of sheep, or softly repeat verses from favorite sagas. The rhythmic nature of the old speech patterns had a cadence not unlike the waves outside that never stopped arriving, even when the world fell quiet. In a time without clocks, the measure of the night was felt in shifts of temperature, the dying of embers, and perhaps in the moment when even the village dog stopped dreaming of chasing seabirds. Sleep was not an escape but a return, a daily voyage to something familiar, safe, and spoken into being. Outside the longhouse, the moon glistened on frost-laced grass. Inside, breaths deepened, and dreams wandered northward into fog and fjord. And as the flames whispered low and the stories slept beside their tellers, one quiet thought flickered to life. Even in the age of warriors and wandering ships, what everyone missed most when they were gone was the sound of home at bedtime. Now then, we'll let the coals smoulder a little longer as we peer ever so gently into what awaited them when the summer light never quite left the sky. The Viking night was not only a time of rest, it was something sacred, wrapped in wool and mystery, salted with stories and snores. And if we peer closely into the dim flicker of a whale oil lamp, we might see it, the stuff of dreams, seaworthy snuggles, and an unexpectedly high thread count. Let's step quietly into an average Viking longhouse at bedtime. Try not to trip over the goat. He sleeps by the fire and has opinions about being stepped on. Inside, the warmth carries a musky peace. It smells faintly of wool, wood smoke, sea salt, and a dozen unspoken dreams. Along the walls, planked and carefully corked against the wind, lie raised wooden platforms, almost bunk beds for the battle-weary and the barley-full. These platforms weren't just beds. They were family alcoves, household headquarters, and sometimes snore-friendly zones of separation. Vikings, as it turns out, took their sleep arrangements with more care than one might expect from people who also believed wearing bear pelts made them invincible. For instance, they structured their bedding with surprising attention to detail. The best families, and even the middlingly ambitious ones, layered wool-stuffed mattresses with animal skins, clean linen if they could afford it, and occasionally, a decorative fur note thrown on top for flair and warmth. It was a hygge hug from a time where firewood doubled as currency. And oh, the pillows. Yes, the Vikings had pillows, despite what you may have feared. They were typically stuffed with duck or goose feathers when birds cooperated, or straw when they didn't. Some even used linen covers, delicately embroidered by someone who probably had 5 kids, a sword-wielding husband, and a dragon head ornament to polish. Now, here's where it gets interesting, and a touch dreamy. Vikings likely slept in shifts, not out of paranoia, mind you, but gentler, older rhythms of the night. Some scholars believe they followed a biphasic sleep pattern, meaning 2 rounds of slumber bookending a lovely little midnight intermission. During that interlude, they might chat softly, whisper prayers to Odin or Freya, tend to the fire, or, depending on the quality of the evening mead, invent poetry about goats wearing boots in this glowing gap between sleeps, known in Old Norse as, well, they didn't really have a term for it, but let's pretend they called it midnight mulling. Stories blossomed. Parents told their children tales of giant wolves and noble gods, of longships that whispered across seas, and of ancestors who could split a fish with a single axe stare. No one quite remembers how accurate those tales were, but that never stopped a good telling. And during this lucid lull, many found solace in spiritual contemplation. It was a time for reconnecting with the self, or at least finding out if Bjorn the Butcher was still snoring in the same key. Honestly, if a modern sleep doctor could prescribe anything new, It might be an hour of candlelit errands in the middle of the night, while wrapped in fur and wisdom. Even more curiously, Viking sleep wasn't solitary. The longhouse gathered everyone under one smoky wooden roof. Family, farmhands, possibly that overly friendly chicken who'd sneak in. This communal coziness may sound like a recipe for chaos, but it fostered a neurochemical bonding cocktail. We haven't entirely matched with all our ergonomic mattresses and noise machines. They didn't just sleep, they nested together. Is it any wonder they slept so well beneath the rustle of straw and storm song outside? Their dreams carried the tensile strength of sea adventures, pranks played on frost giants, and the firm comfort of knowing someone was always tending the fire, even if it was just the goat again. And of course, those lullabies. Not sung sweetly above cribs, but hummed half-consciously, old melodies of myth and marrow, songs that bundled the sleeper in threads far older than wool, songs remembered not for perfection, but because they travelled so well through time. So now, as the longhouse settles into its second sleep and the fire sighs through its last embers, rest assured that even in the windiest places on earth, warmth could always be found in a tightly packed hearth and a tightly woven tale. And out there, just beyond the thatched edge of the dream, another Viking nighttime secret waits to whisper itself across the snow. As dusk thickened in the long-lost winters of Viking Scandinavia, the world didn't rush to finish its to-do list. It yawned and put it off until next spring. The wind whispered through pine forests like an old man mumbling bedtime stories to nobody in particular, and the villages, scattered like breadcrumbs across the frost-bitten landscape, began to fold themselves into slumber. But what truly made Viking sleep legendary, even better than the snoozes of Egyptian pharaohs or Roman emperors, was a peculiar blend of practicality, myth, and just the right amount of fermented fish. Now, in a typical Viking longhouse, where the scent of wood smoke lingered like an over-friendly ghost, and the warmth of the hearth reached sluggishly to the corners of the room, the nightly ritual was far from chaotic. There weren't televisions glowing or smartphones buzzing, unless you count the occasional goat bleating at the moon. People simply knew it was bedtime when the fire turned to embers, the sheep had given up on chewing, and the mead ran out or ran dry, whichever came first. They didn't slip into synthetic pajamas or scroll through doom-infested headlines. Instead, they curled into beds lined with straw and covered in pelts, nestled together like a litter of human puppies. Privacy was optional. Warmth was not. Husbands, wives, children, grandparents, aunts who never married but crushed flax like champions, all spooned without shame. Now, here's where things get surprisingly poetic. They dreamt the Norse way. They believed dreams were messages from the gods, a divine inbox delivered with a puff of sheepy breath and the occasional snore. Odin himself, the Allfather, moonlighted, quite literally, as the god of wisdom and dreams. Falling asleep was not merely rest, it was an act of spiritual diplomacy. This is probably why nobody skipped bedtime. Who were you to ghost Odin? In fact, Vikings went to sleep as a kind of travel. Their sagas tell of dreams that warned kings of betrayal, offered visions of long-lost ancestors waving cryptic advice from beneath tree roots, and sometimes just replayed a particularly good axe throw. These were seen as omens, prophecies, or, at the very least, excellent material for boasting over breakfast porridge. Now, let's talk about lullabies. One might imagine these gruff, battle-worn people growling their children to sleep with tales of serpents and blood. And you would be absolutely correct, yet in a soothing sort of way. Viking bedtime stories were often bits of Edda, those myth-rich poems that blended violence, wisdom, and charm with all the grace of a punch delivered in iambic pentameter. A father might gently stroke his child's hair and murmur, "Remember, my son, Thor once wrestled an old woman named Old Age and lost. So sleep now. She comes for us all." That's basically a Viking goodnight moon. And the architecture of sleep? Equally deliberate. You see, Viking homes were low-ceilinged, not just because people back then were shorter, but because trapped heat meant fewer frostbitten toes. Longhouses inscribed with carved beams acted like communal thermoses. The earth itself often rose up into the bedding, and during the harshest months, insulation came from layers of, well, let's just generously call it organic material. Dung. Yes, but composted, with heart. A warm sleep was better than an elegant one. Even the concept of personal space was flexible. One might dream beside an in-law under Ulfric the dog, partially entangled in Aunt Solveig's shawl, which had been dipped in juniper oil to ward off spirits, or more realistically, lice. So it wasn't unusual to start the night with someone's elbow in your ear, or to wake with a chicken too afraid of the dark to roost alone. Yet, somehow, they slept soundly. Perhaps because nighttime was less about ticking off checklists and more about surrendering to the mythic stillness between one day and the next. Sleep was ritual, and dreams were currency in a realm where gods might throat sing directly into your subconscious. To be a Viking was to sleep like the world would still be there in the morning. Frozen, savage, but yours. And as snow dusted the rooftops like confectioner's sugar, and the stars blinked down through frosty gaps in the roof, the Norse people drifted together into a shared silence. Only the hearth crackled. Only the winter breathed. Softly now. We step further into the dream, into a world not built with swords or songs, but feathers. Feathers. And a rather unexpected innovation, courtesy of Viking pillows. Out on the windswept coasts of Viking-age Scandinavia, night would slip like a woolen blanket over the fjords and forests, ushering in a hush that blanketed even the rowdiest of longhouses. But among these carved wooden dwellings, filled with smoke, song, and possibly one too many tales about Thor's latest hammer-swinging adventures, was an often overlooked treasure of Viking life. Their uncanny ability to sleep absolutely anywhere, and absolutely well. See, today we fret about memory foam versus hybrid coils. The Vikings, they had beds stuffed with straw, feather, or moss, depending on whether you were a chieftain or just particularly lucky to find a dry forest floor. Moss was common, soft, and shockingly good at regulating temperature. And if you've never laid your weary head on a pillow of swan down after a long day of raiding, rowing, and respectful farming, let me tell you, you are missing out. But perhaps even more interesting than what they slept on was where they slept and with whom. Privacy was a modern idea. The Vikings believed more in community snoozing, with longhouses often cradling entire families, livestock, and the occasional bard who'd overstayed his welcome. Warmth was preserved not just by furs, but by proximity, because nothing says bedtime bonding like sleeping between your Uncle Olaf and a goat named Freya. Contrary to modern sensibilities, this didn't bother them one bit. In fact, there's evidence to suggest it lulled them faster to sleep. The rhythmic breathing of several humans and a sheep named Björn may not sound relaxing, but to a Viking, that was a lullaby in surround sound. Now, there was also the matter of nightwear, or more accurately, the lack thereof. Vikings weren't big on pajamas. By all historical accounts, Bedtime often meant simply removing one's outer garments and settling in wearing something ranging from a tunic to nothing at all. This wasn't scandalous, it was strategic. Clothes were valuable, scratchy, and sometimes still flecked with salt water or blood. Better to sleep like a newly hatched chick, naked, peaceful, and perhaps wondering where your axe wound up. But beyond their rustic bedroom aesthetics, the true genius of Viking sleep lay in their natural rhythm. These Norse folk, like most of early humanity, followed the patterns of the sun, with winter nights that lasted for endless hours and summer nights that never truly darkened. The Vikings adapted beautifully, developing flexible sleep schedules that would have made modern sleep scientists cheer softly into their clipboards. In the long, deep nights of winter, they likely experienced segmented sleep, two distinct periods of rest separated by a gentle hour of wakefulness around midnight. This wasn't insomnia, it was cherished. A quiet time for talking, storytelling, perhaps a light snack of smoked fish, or stargazing through the smoke hole, thinking deep, beard-stroking Viking thoughts. And during summer, when the skies barely dimmed and the midnight sun made it tricky to tell time or remember what a candle was for, sleep came when the work was done, and not a moment before. But fear not. Vikings mastered the nap long before it became a Silicon Valley fad. A nap on a sun-warmed rock after pulling in the fishing nets. Peak luxury. Odin himself would have dozed off. One lesser-known marvel of Viking sleep hygiene was their devotion to the gods of rest and dreams, often overlooked in favor of flashier deities. While Thor and Loki ran wild in the sagas, there were gentle spirits, like the Disa, ancestral protectors who watched over descendants in the quiet hours, and who may, just maybe, have whispered pleasant dozy thoughts into their ears as they drifted off. So if you're ever struggling with sleep, just picture it. You, wrapped in woolen furs, a crackling hearth nearby, soot-dusted rafters above, and the low, comforting grunt of a sleeping cow a few feet away. A bard mutters incoherently beside the fire about a sea serpent the size of Denmark. Someone's snoring. It might be you. And somehow, in this chaos, sleep settles like fog over a sleepy fjord. Dreamless, timeless rest. A Viking superpower. But before we close our eyes completely, there's one last mystery to cradle in the quiet of twilight. The final whispered secret behind why the Norse slept so deeply, so soundly, and so very well. As the North Sea whispers lullabies into the midnight mist, and the last embers of a longhouse fire blink like sleepy eyes, we arrive at the final thought, the quiet truth wrapped in wool and lit by the stars above. The Vikings, warriors by day, poets and snugglers by night, had truly mastered the art of sacred rest. By now, you may imagine them less with axes and horned helmets, though historically, nobody wore those horns outside of opera posters, and more as lovers of fermented fish and firm bedding. Yes, that's right. Let's talk about their beds, for in those humble wooden eaves and woven wool blankets lies the secret to why our seafaring ancestors knew very well when to say, enough pillaging for one day. You see, a good Viking bed often consisted of a wooden frame lined with straw. Sounds itchy perhaps. But add a thick layer of lamb's wool, fleece, or feathers, and suddenly your backside is floating over dreams like a longship on a calm fjord. The Norse folk were smart enough to know that only a well-rested raider could successfully shout dramatic things while storming a coast at dawn. And unlike modern humans and their late-night doom-scrolling, Vikings had nature's curfew. The sky, lit only by the aurora or a cloud-heaped moon, said, "Time for bed, Bjorn." And Bjorn listened, mainly because they didn't invent lamps that tasted like stark melancholia and buzzing fluorescence. Instead, their rooms flickered with the buttery glow of whale oil lamps or beeswax candles, which is the lighting equivalent of a cozy whisper in your ear. It also helped that their days were physically exhausting in that very Viking sort of way, hauling nets, rowing ships, debating the exact number of gods you needed to appease before chasing a selkie across the marsh. With bodies properly exhausted, their minds slipped into sleep, not through counting emails or caffeine guilt, but through warmth, the scent of wood smoke, and the crackle of peat-fired dreams. In communal houses, families and animals snoozed together in longhouses that doubled as thermodynamic masterpieces. Heat gathered from central hearths, yes, plural if the house was fancy enough, and bounced off roughly hewn walls lined with turf. Snoring goats, drowsy infants, and a snuggled-up couple who'd shared more than just turnips at dinner. Everyone contributed to the charming chaos of Viking nighttime. Contrary to their grumbly reputation, they cherished music and poetry in the evenings. A skald might recite lines of the Edda by Fireglow, his voice droning somewhere between lullaby and haunted warning. Not that any child was kept up by tales of giants and frost beasts. Monsters frightened the daylights out of you in daylight. At night, they became storybook friends who could be vanquished promptly after breakfast. Sleep was also steeped in symbolism. Dreams were messengers, sometimes of Odin himself, revealing clues, omens, or strong suggestions about who you should or mustn't marry. If you dreamed of fish, it meant you'd soon prosper. If you dreamed of falling overboard, it meant maybe stop snacking before bedtime. Of course, some dreams belong to the gods entirely. In sagas, sleep often becomes a divine pause, where mortals are visited, transformed, or mildly inconvenienced, like being told you have to carry a magical errand halfway across Iceland in nothing but wool socks. But even then, it was understood. One must be well rested before tackling fate. And perhaps that's the real Viking sleep secret. An unspoken cultural agreement that rest wasn't weakness. It was an honored state. A warrior knew that a sharp sword meant little without a sharp mind, and a sharp mind dulled when robbed of dreams. So picture it now. The folk of a fjord village settling into slumber, their breath rising in soft clouds above them, hearths glowing low, the wind whistling nothing urgent. Above them, the stars wheel in their ancient dance, the same stars you see, just less distracted by email notifications. Somewhere outside, a watchman leans into his cloak, listening to the night with one eye and a solid nap in the other. And just like that, we close the longhouse door gently behind us, leaving our Viking friends to their wool-stuffed dreams and sea-born lullabies. Time now to settle yourself into your own bed. Let the sagas settle in your thoughts and allow sleep to take the oars. You've adventured long enough for one evening, brave dreamer. It's time to drift.